The reason we institute governments are to end cycles of capricious and wanton violence, where people impose their moral views on about how other people should behave on those people through the form of violence. We do not believe that the state should institutionalize the very capricious use of violence that it was designed to prevent. So we principally support non-consideration of retributive impulses when it comes to criminal sentencing. What does this look like pragmatically? So first of all, we think it means things like shorter sentences for people who age out of the age range where they might be likely to commit more crimes. So for instance, if you are 70 or 80 years old, it's unlikely you're going to go back out on the street and hold up a grocery store. There was that one Baader-Meinhof group that did that, but they were kind of lame, and then they got thrown back in prison, and it wasn't really a big deal. Second, we think that our justice system would do things like have therapy rather than punishment. That is to say, we would build programs designed to help treat people as opposed to vindictively punish people. And broadly, we think we would have a system more like Norway than the United States. We're American law students, we like this country, but Norway is doing this a lot better than we are. So what I'm going to talk to you about then is first, why we think retribution trades off with other kinds of values. Second, why we think retribution is incompatible with the values that are at the core of a liberal state. And third, why we think other values, specifically deterrence and rehabilitation, are going to be more important and kind of more just than retribution. So first of all, why is it the case that retribution trades off? What's the harm in considering retribution? Well, we think, if you think about putting together a system of criminal punishment, you have a series of factors you're considering to get to an optimal sentence. Now, one of two things is going to happen. Either by contributing retribution, your optimal sentence, so Alex should be sentenced to 5 years in prison, is not going to change at all, at which point you've done nothing and you might as well not have considered retribution. Or you're going to change your consideration. You're going to say, Alex is a really bad guy, let's put him in prison for 7 years. At that point, if you've calibrated a system, that means that you're either going to improperly deter, or you're going to create more likelihood to recommit, or generally speaking, you're going to compromise one of the other values that motivated your calculation in the first place. Yes?
But surely good therapy could explain to people why they deserve to have retributive justice against them?
Right. You could explain to people why you're doing something that's unjust. I actually don't think you could explain it because it is itself unjust. But also, that doesn't justify doing something that's unjust. I might be able to say, Alex, the reason that we put you in prison is that we all hate you, and I might be able to get Alex to be fine with that, but it's not going to change the fact that if we didn't give him things like job training, or if we put him in cells that weren't properly maintained, he's not going to be able to get a job when he gets out of prison. He's going to be more likely to recommit. So, that's why retribution trades off. That's where the harm is. So the next question then is, why is imposing kind of additional sentences on the basis of retribution something that's just principally incompatible with a liberal state? Well, the core value of a kind of liberal society is that we respect the kind of disagreement with other people. That is to say, we in a liberal society believe that all people have kind of equal moral worth, and we're coming together to create a society on the basis that we respect that shared disagreement. I'll take closing.
So like in job training and rehabilitation, they don't really impact any retributive desires. Why is it we can't also have them?
Here, here.
So you can have some of those things, to be sure, but the point is, if those are the motivating values of your system, you don't have a retributive system. No one says to someone, I hate you, you've done something morally wrong, I'm going to give you job skills. What they do is they say, we hate you, we're going to lock him up and throw away the key. So the point is, you guys can certainly have things like job training, but the point is you're not going to build a system with only those considerations in mind. Because to the extent that you say, oh, if we keep Alex in prison for another year or two, it's going to impact his ability to find a job, then you're preferencing a different value over retribution. This is the whole first point that I just talked about why considering retribution trades off with other things. So, given that the core of a liberal society then is respecting disagreement, we think other forms of punishment, for instance deterrence and rehabilitation, I'll get to that in a second, are built on the idea that we respect disagreement of people and we can prevent harm. The only justification of retribution qua retribution is that there is some kind of shared moral commitment that we have that you violated. That is, we have a belief that you shouldn't engage in this kind of thing, you violate it, it hasn't harmed anyone, but we think just generally you've violated this like a dogmatic moral principle that we have, religious or moral commitment. But the whole point of a system that respects disagreement is that we don't think that just violating a moral commitment, if it doesn't actually harm another person, is meaningfully doing something wrong. So we think, therefore, that retribution can only be justified by saying that there are some set of commitments that people need to have that aren't just the kind of respect of other people, and that violating those things without actually is itself something that we need to punish you for. But we think that also, generally, that pragmatically this is going to breed antipathy and distrust of the state. So if you don't have a system of punishment that says the reason that we have this punishment is because other people are going to get hurt if we don't do this, the reason that we have this punishment is that we think you need help, but instead we say the reason that we have this punishment is because you as an individual are in Thailand and you've committed anti-monarchical speech. No one's been harmed, but generally speaking you violated our shared moral commitment that's not tied to any particular person's well-being, so we're going to punish you and inflict harm strictly on that basis. That is a harder sell to people than generally we are doing this thing because we're lifting society collectively. As a result, we think especially in societies that are riven with ethnic strife or religious tension, so places like Poland, for instance, where you have a resurgent group of Catholics who are trying to impose their papist views on people, I'm betraying myself a little bit, we think that you're going to have real problems with buy-in to the state, cooperation with state infrastructure, and generally an ability to participate in a policy as equals. So our last point then is why do we think that other values are preferable, specifically deterrence and rehabilitation? We think that deterrence and rehabilitation reduce violence, as I was saying, and are justifiable without recourse to any kind of shared moral commitments not rooted in respecting other people. That is to say, retribution and deterrence are justified on the basis of the fact that we're going to be reducing the kind of capricious use of violence in the future. So remember how I started by talking to you about the whole reason that we have a government in the first place is that we think it's a problem when you exist in an anarchic state and then Alex can come by with his band of warlords and tell me how I am to live my life. The whole point of having a state is that there's more of a shared order built around a mutual respect of people. We think especially rehabilitation respects the moral agency of worth and people, to the extent that there's a limitation on how we can instrumentalize people, because any tossing someone in prison is always going to violate their liberty. We think that limit is their dignity. That is, the limit on how we can punish people is the extent to which we are helping them. We are treating them as shared moral equals who can be brought back into the fold. By saying people are irredeemable and sentencing them to punitive sentences, all we are doing is instrumentalizing them for no meaningful benefit. And for this reason, we're proud to propose.
Sorry,
There's an official
That's
text that
absolutely
goes
fine,
after
yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much, and welcome the Leader of Opposition.
I find it incredibly interesting that the previous speaker spent so much time talking about dignity when what a crime is committed against you is the complete removal of your dignity. Crimes happen to people because someone has decided that their worth is subservient to yours, right? Like that you become subservient to them. Retribution is the only time in the criminal justice system where victims are actually heard. Some important points of context before I do my refutation. So let's read the motion, right? Because the motion says that the criminal justice system should not consider retribution as a factor in sentencing. So what we have to do on opposition today is just demonstrate to you why in some cases it should be a factor in sentencing. Okay, great. So what that means is that we don't have to support retribution in all instances, and it doesn't have to be the main priority of the justice system, it just has to be a priority of the justice system. So now on to some refutation, right? So they say like, what this justice system, first of all, I just want to say like, on our side of the house, we support Norway, but with retribution, right? We don't have to support like broken down like prison cells and like bad rehabilitation and whatever. We can have like a good world as well, one that just also includes retribution, right? So like one of their points is they say like, oh yeah, like, you know, if you're 70 years old, you're unlikely to commit a crime again. Okay, sure, but if you're the victim of a rape at the hands of a 70-year-old, you can still be incredibly harmed by that experience to a point where you don't feel safe being part of that society. You don't feel safe being active in that society. We think that one of the things we can demonstrate to you is that retribution means that you're more likely to want to continue to participate in society, feel comfortable in society, feel as though your dignity has been restored. Okay, great. So the next thing I want to talk about is they say like, you know, in society, we all have equal moral worth. Well, let's talk about, no thank you, systematic crimes, right? Because we need to talk about who crimes get committed against, right? So for example, like, women are disproportionately likely to be the victims of violence at the hands of men, right? Because men are taught through patriarchy that women are worth less than men, right? Indigenous women in Canada go missing at a much higher rate than white women do because they are seen as less valuable and less human as other women in society, right? So we think that one of the tools that retribution does is it tells those people who have been disregarded by society otherwise that they have value and they are valuable because they are worth punishing this other person for what they have been victims of. No, thank you. Furthermore, what we would say is like, is that there's some crimes that are just worse than others, right? So for example, like even within the same category. So like manslaughter, murder number 1 and murder number 2 are all result in the death of a person, right? But we agree that some of those punishments deserve worse things than others because of intention, right? So we think that, for example, when a crime is particularly malicious, that is a time when retribution should be implemented on those people, right? The final thing I want to talk about is they say like, oh, other values are preferable. That's great, but what they need to prove is that those values are mutually exclusive with also having retribution in the justice system, which I don't think that they will. Furthermore, they talk about deterrence. What we would say is that when you don't have retribution, you're likely to have much lighter sentences. When you have much lighter sentences, you get less deterrence because people are less afraid of committing crimes. Now on to my constructive matter, but first I'll take a POI.
If a victim wants a longer sentence, but that will cause that individual to commit more crimes, haven't you sacrificed each and every individual who suffers that future crime merely to placate the interests of that victim?
Or what if you have someone who gets a lighter sentence, who doesn't get properly rehabilitated, who doesn't understand why they've been punished, who goes out and commits rape again, right?
Here, here.
Yes, that's on your side of the house because that person hasn't been in prison long enough to understand why they have been punished, right? So one of the things that's really important is like victim impact statements, for example, where victims actually get the right to explain. Under your side of the house, those would be completely disregarded by judges. They probably wouldn't exist anymore as an institution. That's something that you guys have to defend. Okay, cool. So the first argument I want to talk about, is about a principal justification for why retribution is important, right? So a crime has been committed against you, right? Against your dignity, and I've explained to you that that means that the perpetrator of that crime thinks that your humanity is worth less than theirs is, right? We think that, like, systematically, the kinds of people who are the victims of violence are disproportionately people who are disempowered in society, right? So we think that what retribution is a tool for the state to tell those people that their lives are actually valued and matter, right? At all. So we think that in and of itself is important, right? The second thing I want to talk about is why this is specifically good for victims, right? As I talked about in my introduction, this is the only time when you as a victim are told that your feelings are acknowledged, that what has happened to you has happened to you and it is a terrible, terrible thing, right? We think that we should be able to prioritize the victim because something has been taken from them at the point at which a crime has been committed against them, right? We think that the sentence should reflect the fact that that feeling has been heard. Sure.
Are you okay with capital punishment?
Like as in the death penalty or like as in like corporal
Death
punishment?
penalty.
Probably not, considering most of the countries in the world don't have it and we're supposed to debate this in an international context. Okay, cool. So I'm interested to hear where that goes. Okay, so then the next thing I want to talk about is like closure, right? We think that there's a huge amount of psychological closure from a victim when a punishment has happened to that person and they know they've had a say in it, right? We think that on our side of the house, that's why victim impact statements are hugely important. We think that even if judges don't weigh them as the most important thing, the fact that judges weigh them at all is likely to be very important to victims because they feel as though they actually can move on now. Someone has been punished for their crime has been acknowledged. We think that's incredibly important because that healing is the only time that person now feels as though they are part of society and that a wrong against them has been righted. We think that when they don't feel that way, they're likely to be withdrawn, they're not likely to participate or feel as though their society values them at all. So the next thing I want to talk about the next thing I want to talk about is about like women and the justice system, right? So I think one thing is like we also like in the past women were told like, oh, you guys get lighter punishments because obviously you're mentally incapable of making decisions, so we give you these light things. We think that people who commit crimes have made choices, right? They've made the choice to do these terrible things to other people. So it's actually fundamentally disrespecting their agency to not punish them the way they deserve to be punished within a retributive framework, right? Because implicitly what that says is your circumstances control you so much to such a high extent that like you can't actually be punished for the things that you've done. We think that when someone commits an incredibly heinous crime that is clearly maliciously motivated, racially motivated, a hate crime, that retribution through the state can be a thing that judges should weigh, right? And they needed to demonstrate to us why other pillars of the justice system are completely mutually exclusive with that. For these reasons, we oppose.
Thank you very much. We welcome the Deputy President.
Speaker, the answer to the POI was revealed, because what we heard in response was two possibilities of why future victims would be sacrificed on our side of the house. One, that the individual would not be reformed, and two, that they would be likely to recommit. This is literally the justification for our bench. What we are saying is that a failure to rehabilitate someone or a failure to deter someone is indeed a good justification for punishing someone. But what they must defend is not the failure for us to actualize our values, but rather a different value. A value that says, yes, a future person may be the victim of a crime. Yes, that individual may not be the person that they want to be, self-actualize and no longer be the sort of person who commits crimes. But still, we must put them in a position where we whip them for no reason other than that they are bad and they are wrong and we want to hurt them. So, in the speech, three things. One, the social message of retribution. Two, how the proxy for catharsis that they attempt to construct fails on their side of the house. And three, how the individual notion of desert can't succeed on their side of the house. Before that, a few pieces of scattered rebuttal. So, they say that crime strips individuals of dignity. That the individual who commits a crime is an individual who denies the essential humanity of the other and imposes their will on them in a dignity-stripping manner. We agree. But what we say is, when an individual does that, the state must not do it back to them. That when an individual must be punished, we must do so on a basis that is not a mere recommission of the eye for the eye notion that they possess on their side of the house, but rather respects their dignity while still respecting the dignity of everyone else in society. That is why we value the other values that we put forward in the freedom of speech. The second bit of scattered rebuttal they say is, what about systematic crimes? And tied to this notion of systematic crimes is the notion of participation. Particularly focused on the deeply gendered notion of violence in the status quo. We agree. But what the gendered instantiation of violence in the status quo reveals is the utter lack of rehabilitation of men in the status quo. What they want is for men to see the deep-seated misogyny that motivates a large amount of the violence in their lives, especially domestic violence, we think. But what that means is they need to be talked to, they need to be made to understood, we need to change them essentially. What we do not need to do is even after they've been deterred, and even after they've been rehabilitated, to continue to hurt them because they've done a very bad thing. Next piece of scattered rebuttal they have, no thank you, is that some crimes are really worse. What about manslaughter, intent, and particularly they have this idea that malice is something that you need to punish. Malice is something that we care about because it proxies for the likelihood of continuing to do it again. It is the sort of motivation that makes us highly confident that in the individual case of deterrence, this is the sort of person that we need to deter more. What we need out of the deputy LO and the opposition bench in general is a principled justification why even if that is not true, we should still continue to harm that person. I'll take POI from closing.
So would you eliminate mitigatory factors in sentencing? For instance, if someone from an incredibly poor background?
So only to the extent that they do not proxy for deterrence or for rehabilitation, right? This is case by case. Like some of them will and some of them won't, right? Okay. Lastly, the notion of moral value. That's going to be substantive. Okay, so what is the social notion of retribution that they must accept on their side of the house? Because the thing that we've not yet talked about is they cannot just retribute against people and do it behind closed doors. When you construct a justice system, the way in which you allocate and justify punishments is an essentially public phenomenon. That is to say, there's the private effect of criminal justice and there's the public effect. And the public effect matters too. Because every single sort of justification that they put forward must be one of two things. It must be unstable because it is a lie. That is to say, they could justify on the basis that they're actually deterring or they actually rehabilitating it, but over time criticism will undermine that foundation because it will not be true. Or they will say, we have the basis to say, these people are wrong and bad because they have done something. And indeed, because they've done something, we can void their humanity. We can punish them, not in a way to reduce future crime, not in a way to make them better, but literally to say as the state, they are bad and they are wrong and they must be punished. There are two issues we think with that. One is, on a pragmatic level, it otherizes. Large numbers of states in the status quo construct their national identity on shared mores that we think are not, are only majoritarian and not universal throughout the society. That creates an alienating effect whereby religious, ethnic, other minorities do not accept some of the bases for the justifications. They may say, those are the sorts of punishments that we don't support. Nathaniel's example about Thailand is the sort of thing that we wouldn't accept. But what they can't get away from is that the sorts of justifications that support retribution support those very sorts of punishments. Which leads me to my second point about the proxy for catharsis and the way that punishments are constructed.
Sorry.
So, sure.
Okay, if you're the victim of sexual assault, and because you have no say in the justice system, that person gets out, they have a light punishment, and they commit assault again, don't you think that person feels at least implicated because they could have put them away if only they had retribution?
Right, so this is the proxy for catharsis argument that I was literally getting to. So, two things to note about this. One is, it is not retributive to reduce the amount of catharsis in society. These are two separate sorts of justifications, and I would like to hear on opposition bench why if something is more retributive but reduces catharsis, whether or not they're okay with that, right? These are just not the same thing. The second thing we say is, the sorts of things that look to those victims tend to do two things. One, they massively over-incarcerate people. Victims, having suffered the particularized harm, have massive incentives if they're included in the justice system, for example, by statements to the juries or to the judge before a punishment is decided upon in a courtroom. They have massive incentives to always push for the absolute harshest thing, because we think they are not in a good epistemic position to actually assess the moral blameworthiness of the individual who has committed the crime. But secondly, we think it would society create bad classes of crime. Why is crack cocaine punished so much in the United States? Except for a deep-seated belief that the sorts of people who use crack are the sorts of bad people that need to be punished more. They cannot get out of the fact that there's a real social meaning. Finally, on the notion of desert and the notion that they just deserve worse punishment. So, three things to say. One is, I don't really know what the basis for the worseness is, and I want to hear more from them before we accept this justification. Secondly, we do not think you can sacrifice other people's lives merely on the basis of the asserted difference in blame and guilt. But thirdly, to the extent that that's true, and to the extent that you're still okay with sacrificing these other people, we think that these people are not actually blameworthy. Look, in every single society, you grow up in a household with parents, in a culture, in an education that you do not choose, you do not elect, you do not get to decide. What they must justify is by those very factors, which overwhelmingly create crime, are the sorts of bases that make people worse. Not mean rehabilitation, not mean deterrence, but worse. We propose.
I thank that speaker very much, and welcome Deputy
So why do we not like crime in the first place? And I don't think that it's just the physical problem of potentially being assaulted or just the physical problem of having something taken away from you. It's the psychological suffering that causes when somebody says that the needs that I have are more important than the needs that you have. And that is, and by having retribution, you allow the government to say that by virtue of that person causing you suffering, they now deserve to suffer. It is the only causal way to say that your suffering matters in a way that will then create consequences in the world. And that is why we think that if you're speaking about the victims who have had something taken away from them, we need to prioritize having the state say, yes, we're doing this because what that person did is, and this is a dirty word for opening government, bad, right? Okay, so I'm going to be speaking about general issues in this instance, but firstly, some clarification again, right? When the last speaker speaks about mitigatory factors like, oh, you know, you've lacked opportunities and things like that, we're okay with mitigatory factors being taken into account, but we think that retribution should be taken into account as well. Importantly, we think that a lot of people don't rape other people, and so it is fair that a lot of the time those mitigatory factors are not going to explain everything, and this is particularly when retribution plays an important role. Other things, we're not going to necessarily lock people away and throw away the key. We can have rehabilitation measures. We think that so we think that a lot of their problems were actually not really inherent in this debate. So what was the main issue that they brought to us? Well, they said it's bad if the state is able to say that a certain type of person is bad and that they are wrong, because in a liberal state we need to be respecting disagreements. This is a very nice way of putting respecting people who are happy to sexually assault another person. And again, we don't need to speak about every crime in this instance. It's their burden to show that we shouldn't consider retribution even when somebody has done something that is clearly wrong. So we think that when the liberal state respects disagreement, we don't think that that means that they say, well, well, everything is subjective, and so we can never say that somebody has done something wrong. In fact, by like trying to avoid rapes and sexual assault in the future, they were already saying that that type of thing is wrong and then acting and limiting people's freedom based on that assumption that it's wrong. So we don't think that something huge changes that now the state is making these value judgments that they weren't making before. But importantly, what happens with a liberal state is they play according to the rules of the game. So they say, we respect your humanity, we respect your dignity, etc., as long as you are willing to do that for other people. So when somebody decides not to do that, they opt out of the rules of the game, and as such, the state can punish them for not playing according to those rules. In the same way that we don't think that it's against like the freedom of like the liberal state to incarcerate people, even though generally the state should like respect freedom of movement, because when that kind of incarceration occurs, because when that kind of incarceration occurs, it should be justified by the fact that somebody hasn't respected the values of the liberal state. And there are some things that were objective, like rape is bad, and we only really need to defend like those types of things, because you have to say retribution is never right. So we don't need to defend crack cocaine like the war on drugs or anything like that. All right. Any POIs about this? Okay.
Sure. Which of these two do you want to give up? Do you want to sacrifice deterrence? Do you want to sacrifice rehabilitation?
Okay, so we don't think that they are mutually exclusive. So importantly, part of the harm of the crime is the suffering that somebody takes over, right? So we think that the victim is owed something. And Patricia spoke a lot about that, so I'm going to reiterate that in the future. But importantly, I just explained all the ways that retribution can be justified, right? So that means that like when the state does this, people aren't suddenly going to like buy out, right? Or say, the state just has malice against me. Because like that relies on this being unjustified in the first place. If it is justified, which is what this debate is, right? Then it means that the state could just say like, you deserve to be punished because you did not respect like the rights of a woman. And we think that anybody who's truly rehabilitated would say, I see your point. I see that like I don't deserve to be able to walk free. So that all relies on the fact that this is unjustified in the first place. Okay, then secondly, let's speak about what people actually deserve. And here what we told you is that the person who's really on the back foot here is somebody who's something has been taken from them. So your sexual gratification meant that I lacked my bodily autonomy and like you attacked me, right? So I'm the one who has suffered in this instance. If anything, the state has an obligation to all of their citizens and should be ensuring that those who are most vulnerable, who are often the victims of crime, which has a psychological effect on them, are respected within that justice system. And that's what Patricia told you. So it gives that back. We think that even if it's something like just your gratification, just because it's a biological need to like want to see somebody who's done something wrong to us punished, that's still something that you're then entitled to because that crime by its very essence took something from you. But importantly, this is the only way that the justice system ever says that your pain actually matters, and so we are taking it into account in our process instead of just saying, well, like, just because it won't happen again. So for example, if an old man really hurts you, that's still taken into account in the justice system, meanwhile your side is saying that that person, if they're not going to be able to do it again, shouldn't be punished at all. That means that it gives the impression to somebody that they never get the exposure of something happening to the other person, but importantly, that like they didn't matter within that justice system, that justice system didn't care about them. It's why people become so hurt when like Brock Turner goes free even after like raping a woman, or like black people get shot and police officers never face justice. It's because what that says is that the justice system doesn't prioritize their pain or care about their pain, and that's more than just deterrence. I'll take closing.
If we prioritize the biological need of the victim to see the criminal punished, why doesn't the justice system allow victims to design the punishment of the criminal?
Okay, well, we think that things should be balanced. So as we told you at the beginning, we don't like disagree with mitigatory factors being taken into account if someone didn't have a choice, right? So we think that often like the victim will want something that's even more extreme and that should be balanced with the other person's right. But overall, we think that like at least you need an acknowledgement of that pain, right? You need to say that like, and often the justice system will do this, right? If you've been raped, like potentially the person should be going to prison for a very long time because it's acknowledgement of the extent of what was done against you. Okay, but then finally, let's talk about the person themselves who's being punished. We think that part of like being respected as a human being is that the state says you have moral agency and you made your decision. In the same way that women weren't held accountable for a very long time because they were seen as like children, irresponsible for their actions, we think it might actually increase somebody's dignity to be held accountable for what they do in their process. We also think that this has got utilitarian benefits. Things like you're more likely to be accepted back into your community once retribution has taken place. Things like people are more likely to accept justice once they've seen this kind of deterrence take place and not think that they have to take it into their own hands. Ladies and gentlemen, if it comes to who deserves justice, we tell you that it is the victim before the perpetrator.
I thank our speaker very much and all speakers in the top half. We welcome the member of government.
I'd like to clarify at the beginning of my speech that retribution does not mean zero punishment. The word retribution literally means proportionality, which means if a crime is committed to a certain degree, you have to punish that person to the same proportion, which leads to things such as solitary confinement for vicious criminals, which leads to, in principle, things like death sentences for murderers. That is what retribution in this world and in this context means, which, by the way, the op concedes to through the POI. I think before getting into my extensions directly, the only literal extension from OO is victims matter, we need to restore their dignity. I have like 5 sets of responses to this. First, the only way to redress victims' dignity is by twofold. A, victims getting what they want themselves. We think victims at a point in time where they've been like unfairly harmed are like fucking irrational, which means what they want is often to a greater degree than the harm caused to them, which means in principle, if retribution through victims is the most principally important thing, you're principally agreeing to a victim getting capital punishment on a person who's unfairly racially fired them from a job, because that's the only thing that makes the victim happy, and that victim has a choice to choose this. The other way to do this, by the way, is by the state deciding what that crime and punishment looks like. And at that point in time, we're not quite sure why. It's unfair for it to just be some punishment, which the state decides is a good thing for society, which we'll prove through our response. That's the first thing. Second, retribution rarely makes a victim happy, which is to say that if I have been already a victim of a crime, I don't think no matter how much you punish the criminal, I will be redressed for the crime, and ultimately will lead to me being happy. But thirdly, oftentimes I get more afraid. I feel unsafe, which is to say that because the individual is being punished so harshly, I feel a certain backlash from the majority community they talk about. I often feel further worse because of the immense amounts of harshness associated with that crime. But fourth, we also don't see the moral distinction or the mutual distinction that the victim gets by seeing the perpetrator go to like prison for 1 year versus 3 years. The perpetrator still goes to prison, which is to say the victim still sees some redress, which we have in our world as well. But fourth, the ultimate thing that victims want is prevention of future crime and evolution by which no further victim in society suffers from that same crime. We'll prove that in our extension. Before that, Laura, sure.
So like, you're saying there's no distinction between the amount of redress between a sentence for community service as opposed to a 5-year prison sentence?
Obviously there is, which is why we want to stop it. It has severe harms, which we'll prove in our extension. I'm not quite sure what that leads to. So, extensions. First, we think society at large has evolved, which is to say, historically humankind were hunters, were vicious war pillagers that were okay with things such as war crimes back in the prehistoric ages. We live in a very liberal world today, by which human beings have evolved. The conclusion of this is simple. Human beings innately have made bad decisions historically, and we think that humankind has a way to evolve through this. The reason for this is the world literally has no free will. There is no decision that human beings make based on pure randomness. Your decisions are always determined by the society you live in, the conditioning you've received. Which is to go on to show that if free will is pure randomness, we don't believe human beings are a random species. They make decisions based on the circumstances they live in, the society they lived in, the experiences they've had. This concludes to, crime is a result of your conditioning and the circumstances you're living in, and every criminal decision is one such as this. What are these conditionings that lead to such crimes? We think there are 2 kinds of conditionings. One, societal conditioning that has benefited certain groups over others, which leads to certain underprivileged groups committing crimes in respect to redressing that certain hierarchy that exists, whether it's between rich and poor, whether it's between white and black, which is to say that most of these communities make the decision to commit a crime to redress that condition. Or it is the privileged group of people who have been conditioned to think that they are privileged, and it is the world system by which they have to maintain that privilege, which is why they go on to things such as exploitation, labor exploitation, etc., etc. That's societal conditioning. Second, internal conditioning, which is to say, certain individuals feel certain emotions, such as empathy, greed, jealousy, that make them commit an action that commits that crime. We think the only difference between us, normal law-abiding citizens, and a criminal is the action of taking that emotion and committing an action out of it. We've all felt jealousy in our lives. We've all wanted to be rich, but the only thing we didn't do is commit an action out of that emotion. We think these people committed that action. The conclusion of this entire moral principle, and this is the comparative, the only thing that is absent in criminals is conditioning. We think human nature can be reconditioned, and at no point in time is a human being ever irrelevant to society, and at no point in time can you lose faith in human beings, because if all of us as law-abiding citizens have been conditioned to act in a certain way, someone who hasn't had the fortune or the arbitrary moral luck of getting that conditioning can be reconditioned to fulfill those needs. That's how we think success stories of rehabilitation have worked, which is why historically so many people have been rehabilitated. Before that, sure, Upper.
Okay, sure. So, your side of the house completely takes victim impact statements out of the legal system, which means their voices are not taken into account, and they're being told their voice doesn't matter, even though their dignity has been impinged upon by another.
We literally give them certain redress through certain punishment. We're not quite sure why it has to be to such a great degree. That's a comparative OO missed. Why it's always their choice as to what kind of volition they want, rather than a state, third party, choosing what's good for society. Okay, so the response we expect from CEO to this is, okay, we can have both at the same time, right? You can retribute and then rehabilitate, and the conditioning is fine and everything's great. Here's the problem. The trade-off is putting these people in retribution means they're permanently criminals and there's no redress from it. Because understand what this immense life in horrible prisons look like. It's like interacting with organized crime lords, understanding what that means, understanding that you're told by society that you're a criminal forever, which means internally you feel worthless, but externally there's an immense amount of pressure in you that tells you that prison is your society, there is no society out there for you. The only response from OO to this is, look, prisons will be good as well. We think firstly, there's no political will that prevents prisons from being bad, because literally the victims you want to support are going to ask for bad prisons if they're going to be protected, and retribution has to be harsh for it to work. If it's like a prison cell with a LED TV, I'm not quite sure why retribution will work in that instance. We think it has to be harsh for it to work. Lastly, and this is the most important piece of material, even if crime is committed out of free will, we think human beings are innately moral, which is to say there's always an immoral aspect that human beings feel through emotions that have been biologically given to us, which is to say that even if a crime is completely irrespective of condition, there's a way to fix it because of the internal morality that we've been built with. We think we can appeal to that through the rehabilitation process that has worked, ladies and gentlemen. The conversation can't stop at certain crimes being solvable, because historically and through the evolution of humanity, we've changed the way perceptions of life work. We think today is not the end of the world. We will evolve from this as well. Very glad to close.
I thank Dr. Speaker very much, and welcome the member of opposition.
So I don't think retribution needs to be stupid. I don't think prisons have to become cesspits. And I think we can have some degree of nuance. I imagine that retribution means slightly longer sentences. It does not mean we're going to keep people in cages in solitary confinement for the rest of their lives. We accept there probably is some degree of trade-off, but it's nowhere near as extreme as that CG outline, and because they're unwilling to engage in realistic counterfactual, that's probably why they're happy to debate. Two things in the speech. Firstly, about buy into the criminal justice system, why this is extremely important to achieve any of the benefits the government side wants. Secondly, why society has a principled right to retribution. First issue, buy into the criminal justice system. The Prime Minister opens his speech by saying the point of the criminal justice system is to end the cycle of capricious violence perpetrated by individuals. This is then echoed by closing government and repeated very similarly. The point of this is allowing the state to mediate conflict, allowing protection of the weak by society as a whole. And what we're going to explain from closing opposition is why a trust in the system is necessary to achieve this at any level, and why if you don't have it, you get all the harms the government have outlined. Opening opposition have proved that the individual instance of retribution, why that's important. We're going to prove why why they only need to prove one individual instance of retribution within the rates. That's obviously true, but we're going to prove the general principle, which we think is probably more important in the vast majority of instances. Why is retribution important? Without it, we think it's an a priori statement. People are unlikely to trust in the criminal justice system. Why this is the case? Retribution is some innate desire we all have, and certain crimes should be punished in certain ways. If it's a case that we never see the punishment actually matching what we want, we probably ultimately need the situation where the criminal justice system is completely incongruous with our intuitions. If it never matches what we want with it, we're likely to lose faith. This is three extraordinarily important examples. The first one is the most obvious. People don't go to the police or don't go through a sentencing. And I think it's really obvious why. Reporting crimes is a horrific experience. You have huge personal embarrassment you go through when you have to go to the police and ultimately go on the stand and plead your case. You have the trauma of cross-examination, and certain forms of crime can be absolutely horrific. People trying to tear you apart and saying that something that did happen to you is untrue. And there's also the fear of society seeing you as a liar when you have to go on the record and publicly state what happened to you in the most intimate detail, and potentially people not believe you. If at the end of that process you think there's going to be no point because the punishment is completely discongruous with what you think it should be, people are unlikely to ever go forward. People are unlikely to report. And it's probably the case that this applies to some crimes more than others. We think as a general statement, it means that people don't ultimately report crime. Why does this matter? Two reasons. One, the same people are likely to keep committing crimes again and again, because once you fall into that process of committing crime, it's very easy to take that step and do it again and do it repeatedly. If there's never a deterrence, if there's never a situation where you actually go to jail, you likely keep doing that. We think that means more crimes happen. We think that's something that is problematic. But secondly, you create an entire culture in society where it's easier to fall into committing crimes because there isn't seen as either being genuine deterrence for them, but more importantly, it never seems to be the case that you actually have consequences for them. Why is this important in terms of how the debate's played out? You lose all aspects of deterrence and rehabilitation that all of the government bench launch if crimes are never reported in the first place and you never get to the sentencing. We think that's something that is really important. Additionally, all the harms of victims being screwed that our opening has really eloquently outlined still applies if they're never able to go to the criminal justice system in the first place. We think that's something that is a problem. Go ahead.
So I think the reason why deterrence works is that you fear punishment in the first place. The fact that these people have already committed a crime shows that they don't fear punishment. So there's certain conditioning that you need to change about.
Stop. If people aren't going to report crimes, there's no fear of deterrence because you don't think you're actually going to ever face any form of punishment. So it doesn't matter how harsh the punishment is or isn't. If society as a whole is unwilling to see them as important, people don't go forward. If you never get to that end stage, it means that you're likely to rehabilitate. Because you're never likely to rehabilitate because there's no incentive to do so. No, thank you. Second potential harm. People taking justice into their own hands. Lynch mobs, vigilante groups, they emerge if society loses faith in the criminal justice system because it's seen as being something that simply will not achieve the end you want. As a consequence, you take matters into your own hands. We acknowledge there's probably certain countries this applies much more so, and many of them aren't going to be in the West. We do think it applies as a general principle everywhere, even in the world. And we think, as a general note, even an extraordinarily harsh sentence is likely to be less harsh than the tyranny of a lynch mob. We think the checks and balances of a legal system are likely to be better than no checks and balances that exist within mob forms of justice. And we think a situation where you've had the criminal system being what is actually used, going to courts and using the mechanisms of the state rather than individuals taking capricious violence into their own hands as opening government fear is something that is better. So we get that on our side. Third issue, criminal rehabilitation. This is going to engage quite strongly with what we heard from closing government. We think it's already really hard for ex-cons to rehabilitate themselves in society. We think that gets worse when people see them as never having been adequately punished in the first place. We think this is what really beats closing government's prison point. Because ultimately, if no one in society is ever willing to forgive you, that's probably significantly worse than the fear that people might start liking prisons too much and think they want to be there rather than be free, which is a weird point in and of itself. We think as a general note, it is wrong to prevent people from having genuine chances of re-entering society, forming relationships when they get out of prison. And we think to some degree this means that retribution does proxy for deterrence and rehabilitation, but why it proxies is because it's about satisfying what society as a whole wants and what society's members want, and that's what we get on our side of the house. Open.
Even if you focus on a narrow range of cases where the punishment is not controversial, Why have societies like Sweden and Norway accepted the very short punishments for things like murder that you claim societies cannot accept?
I mean, I don't think in general they have, and I don't think just saying Sweden and Norway exist is a substitute for analysis. I really like to know what specific things you're talking about in Sweden and Norway. I also know they've got also quite bad crime statistics in a number of circumstances, in horrific situations, people not reporting crimes, so I think it might actually be much worse than that. Also, for those two trade-off examples, Singapore's super harsh and it's also really good, so we have that one. Why does trust in the system outweigh everything on an analytical as opposed to an example framing people? The lack of it exacerbates every single harm I've been up to that point, and it cuts through all of CG's points of condition, explaining why it is necessary people go to the criminal justice system in the first place and why that trust is vital. It also goes beyond OO's concerns for individual victims because it applies to everyone in society, which we think is something that is probably important, at least to some degree, and probably means we take that point. Second argument, society has a right to retribution. Society is ultimately just a collection of individuals agreeing to live together. And a crime is not just an attack on an individual, but it's a threat to everyone's ability to live together in some degree of harmony and safety. And as a consequence, any crime is an attack on all of society. We think as a consequence, society has a right to impose sentences that are in line with how great an affront it sees this as being. And we might be certain, for example, that, I don't know, after a 45-year sentence, a murderer is never going to physically be able to recommit. But if it was a particularly heinous murder, we're fine giving them a longer sentence if that's something we think society sees as important, a significant sort of violation of people's rights and violation of all society is so great that everyone in society has a baseline intuition this is something that we would want to see. But we also think it's the same for the inverse, and this is why the point of information about mitigation was important, because to some degree we do agree with closing Dove that retribution is about proportionality, and that there can be a lack of desire for retribution, that's something that is important. And we think it's reasonable to give lower sentences, even if it does mean less deterrence to their crimes, because we think there is a difference between someone who's rich and stealing for fun, and someone who's really poor and stealing to try and feed their family, and we're happy for that to be reflected. We think ultimately it is morally right for society to make the punishments reciprocal to how bad they are seen and the impact that they have. We think a moral right in and of itself outweighs anything else. Consequences, so even if you don't buy all of our practical stuff, which you should, this still wins the debate. Extremely happy to oppose.
I thank our speaker very much and welcome the government whip.
We were the first team in this debate to really talk about the origination of a crime. Why do crimes take place in the first place? It's because of the conditioning that individuals receive as a consequence of being part of a particular society that they did not have the ability to choose at birth, and also because of some innate human programming which also they were unable to choose at birth. We acknowledge that certain individuals don't behave in the norm that we expect them to, and we think it is a moral responsibility of humankind to not acknowledge and condemn these individuals as people who can be fixed and keep them in jail cells forever, but rather make an active attempt at trying to make sure that these individuals change. The tangible impact of all of this looks like a world in which we don't tag certain people as innately bad, something that the OG already talked about, but this also looks like a world in which prisons are not tagged as areas where you're confined for the rest of your life, but an area where you try to transform yourself as a better individual who can come back and play a more responsible role in society and adhere to the principles that humankind adheres to on a regular basis. We think that is the most biggest responsibility of state. About retribution, let's talk about integration because this has become such an important point. So that CO thinks that integration is difficult when society thinks that you have not been punished enough. We think if the society has a thirst for exerting violence, torture, on inhumane conditions on certain individuals who they think deserve those things, we think it's innately, we think that it's intrinsically not principled to quench that thirst by exerting these things on state. We think the state has a moral high ground that they need to adopt and a moral high ground that they need to sustain and cannot let victims design punishments. We have done away with capital punishment. We have done away with victims being able to do whatever they want, like carry out like a murder for a murder, so the way that we have seen in societies in the past. We think we have evolved from all of this, and we think this is inherently problematic. But integration is hardest when society perceives that you are bad or evil to begin with. We think that is where Sajid's analysis becomes very, very important. Because the point at which you are sent to jail, society gets this understanding that you're inherently a human being who cannot be fixed and who has certain qualities which cannot be changed. We think this is where a stance shift towards a more rehabilitative society is where you acknowledge that certain individuals may not have been lucky enough to be born with the conditioning that others receive, and then therefore you make an active attempt to change these individuals. So if you consider victims, if you consider the rest of the society at large, they recognize that this was a mistake made by an individual at a certain point of time because of certain irrational decisions taken as a consequence of physical, emotional conditioning, but we think that can be fixed if human beings attempt at doing so. Yes?
Even if you are wired to rape, the fact is that your sexual gratification came at the cost of someone else's suffering. We think that that person is then entitled to reciprocally gain something back through the justice.
Yes. So you know what states do as a consequence of this? They push down really, really hard on individuals that they're able to identify as rapists, but don't really do anything substantial to change that system. This is where you give an opportunity for states to hide within that failure, because the individuals that they do find guilty, they really clamp down with incredibly harsh punishments and make it a point to the rest of the society that this is how we punish individuals, but they don't really do something to change the society at large. We think victims are best served when you take account of a state failure in protecting a particular victim and use that lesson to change the rest of society to be one that is more conducive for particular victims at large. We think disadvantaged societies have much to gain have more to gain from the punishment of an individual, they have incredibly more to gain from the society being reshaped at large rather than one individual being punished really, really hard. We think these individuals will like their basic rights back, or a society which is more conducive to their development and acceptance. We think all of those things are particularly important because our world does not look like one in which victims' responses are not heard. Obviously, they get their space in court to talk about all the things that happened during the crime, during the investigation process, and we think all of those are particularly important. But the point at which we feel that we give victims the space to design the punishment, we think that is inherently problematic. But understand more that what the tag does to you in general. We think if a society at large is to try and make sure that more individuals don't commit crimes, we think it's appropriate to understand that it places more effort in educative facilities that make sure that these individuals don't do that crime. We think it's inherent, that it's quite abhorrent that certain states pride in harsher punishments as opposed to making sure that you have a system in which these crimes don't occur in the first place. Yes?
So when we read in newspapers that criminals are given sentences wholly out of line with what we think they should be, how is society going to forgive these criminals when that's the only way they engage the criminal justice system, not this weird granular step process of people
Great. This is where the CEO's analysis of a very unrealistic world in which individuals don't report crime at all comes into take place. We don't think that is likely to be true. Individuals still report crimes because their desirable objective is to make sure that the society at large changes. Their desirable objective is to make sure that they feel more safe after they have been subject to some sort of state inefficacy to prove them failure. We don't think their inherent desirable objective is to make sure that the person who has committed that crime, to see that individual have violence exerted upon him, and if that is so, I think that is something that needs to change. But we think at large, there are tangible impacts that we walk away as a society when you change your inherent stance towards one which is more rehabilitative. You make cops in prison feel more empathetic towards individuals who are inside and not make them treat them badly. This is how reactions such as over-exaggerated punishments, larger sentences in like solitary confinement take place, which makes individuals who are incarcerated not come out too often because they give up on themselves, and that is literally the worst thing that can happen. This is also important in Sajid's analysis as to how individuals need to feel hopeful about themselves, about being able to come back to society and serve a more responsible role. At the point at which individuals feel helpless, they think that the state has abandoned them, this behavior or this attitude trickles down to their future generations, and entire societies at large commit more crimes and give into more state in-cooperation regarding the maintenance of law enforcement, and we think that is the point at which more crimes prevail and states break down. We think a world in which you take into account the social conditioning and not take retribution into account, a world in which you recognize that there is an inherent disadvantage and harm created by tagging individuals as inherently evil and individuals who can't be changed, you create a far, far worse world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to close out the debate, welcome the opposition representative.
To victims and to society, vengeance is incredibly important. And because the way the criminal justice system works requires the interaction of societies with the justice system itself, if their side of the house turns people off from that interaction, the criminal justice system falls apart. Because we tell you that on closing opposition, and because all the benefits from both sides of the house and every other team is contingent on people interacting with the justice system, and because we prove from their side of the house we don't get that, we take this debate. As such, 3 arguments in the speech. 1, on societal views and the interaction of society with the criminal justice system. Second of all, on the idea of free will, as brought up by closing government. And lastly, just rebutting the rest of opening government's case about how this interacts with the rest of all the other pillars of justice that we consider, things like deterrence and things like rehabilitation. So first of all, on societal views, right? First of all, notice that most people, fortunately, aren't criminals, right? And the way the criminal justice system works is for individuals to, the vast majority of individuals to have the will and the wants to interact with the criminal justice system itself. And so the way in which these people are valued is incredibly important because they are the people who haven't committed the crimes in which we put people in jail for. I think opening opposition allude to this in their speech. What does Al uniquely give you in his own speech? No, thank you. He tells you that people are less likely to interact with the criminal justice system when victims and society aren't getting revenge, right? And why is this the case? It's because when a victim goes forward to the court and reports a crime, it is incredibly damaging for them themselves. They often have to go through cross-examination, they have to go into the witness box where every detail of the rape or murder has to come out of their own mouths. It's an incredibly destructive process for them, and the only time that they're going to be willing to do so is if they think at the end of the road there's going to be some sort of justice, there's going to be some sort of revenge, right? Now, this is how you are. These people are going to prison anyways, but oftentimes the length and duration and the type of punishment is incredibly, has an incredibly large impact, right? Like, for instance, when Oscar Pistorius was sentenced to 5 years in prison, South Africa and most of the world was an absolute outrage, right? And the reason for that is because it is the perceived lack of revenge that occurred within that interaction that made people incredibly angry. And we think that makes people less likely, to interact with that system in the future. Why is this incredibly impactful? Because all of the arguments from government are contingent on things like, for instance, people having rehabilitation or victims getting some sort of desert anyways. That is all contingent on these people even going to the court system in the first place, right? And second of all, I also tells you get things like vigilante justice, like lynch mobs or people who take justice into their own hands. That's where you get all the horrible things associated with that. Now, I just want to caveat and make this incredibly clear, right? And just to clarify before anyone decides to misrepresent us. We're not saying no one is going to interact with the justice system. A lot of people are. But enough people will. There is a chance and there is a large number of people who also will not interact with that system. And as a result, result, you got all the harms that we outlined in our speech. Before I go on, close it.
The decision to interact with the system is based on the worst case scenario outcome of the interaction being worse than the status quo. We think even if there's no punishment, you're still more likely to feel safe, which is why you report rather than not report.
Because going forward to the court is incredibly distressing and incredibly damaging, right? Like a rape victim who has to recount exactly what happened on the night to the court is so horrific, right? And that is a trade-off that they'll be unwilling to make if they don't think the court system is something that is vengeful and doesn't take into account the idea of catharsis. No, thank you. Now, closing government, right? Now, they give us this really weird argument about people have no free will. One, that's a pretty absurd statement to make in a 7-minute speech to prove that there is no free will. I mean, philosophers have been doing this for the past 100 years and they haven't come to a conclusion. Like, two, yes, maybe. We agree, conditions are important, right? If you grow up in a poor family, if your father and mother were drug addicts, it is likely you are likely to commit more crimes. That is why we have mitigating factors that Al talked about in his speech, and I pointed out in the POI, where if you grow up in terrible circumstances, we mitigate those factors for you, and we make it less likely that you go to jail, right? But the fact of the matter is there are a lot of people who these mitigating factors cannot take into account. Like the fact that very often people commit crimes because of greed, because of anger, because they're just fundamentally evil people, right? Like the CEO who robs millions from old people, or the child abuser who rapes and murders little boys, right? These are people who are fundamentally evil, and don't let them get away by saying they have no choice and free will in this, right? Yes, circumstances are important. Yes, circumstances do play a factor, but your own personality and your own personhood also plays an incredibly massive factor in this decision. So we have a right to punish you for those particular crimes. No thanks. Now, why is this incredibly important, right? One, because the entire premise of the case about free will falls apart the moment they never prove it and simply assert to you that free will doesn't exist. But two, even if we agree that to some extent free will doesn't exist, there is enough free will with evil people committing crimes to agree that is something that we should consider incredibly important. Secondly, on society's views of punishment, no thanks. It's something, again, the closing government tries to bring up. They say, society's views of punishment are contingent on the fact, right, that you have things like punishment, that you have things like retributive punishment. That's not true, right? I think if we got rid of retributive punishment, most people would consider a child abuser to be evil. Most people would consider a thief to be horrible, right? Like, the fact of the matter is, the way the criminal justice system labels these people doesn't remove the fact they are considered evil people, right? It is society's want for them to be labeled evil people, and society's pre-existing view that they are evil people. That means we want some sort of revenge. That means we want some sort of catharsis. That is incredibly important in considering when these people actually interact with the justice system in the first place. Okay.
If the way you stave off mob violence against unpopular groups is by having the state proxy for the mob, why will the groups they belong to trust and go to?
Because it's not proxying the mob, right? There's a huge difference between taking out a gun and shooting the person who killed your wife and reporting it to the police, right? Like, there's a huge distinction there that I think you guys just aren't getting at. Okay, so opening government, right? I'm done with what closing government said. Opening government. I think remaining in this debate, I think, are two fundamental arguments. One is this argument about dignity, and the second is about other values that we consider important within the justice system. On dignity, right? What are they? Basically, their argument is this. If you take revenge as something that's important, that is a fundamental loss of dignity. There's a logical mismatch there, right? I don't see why it is that putting someone in jail for 10 years and taking away their freedom of movement and lots of other freedoms we associate with humanity, or putting them in jail for 20 years is necessarily such a big dignity, a loss of dignity, that it's something we should consider particularly important, right? They need to explain to us why this dignity argument is relevant in the first place, considering we already strip away the dignity of criminals because they've done that to other people. Secondly, they say there are other values we need to sacrifice, right? Like one, I think just pointing out very simply, right? They never gave you any mechanistic analysis as to why there is a sacrifice of other values, right? This is a common argument in debates, where everyone assumes if you put someone in prison for longer, it means they're more likely to reoffend, right? I don't know how true that is. They need to give you some logical analysis to suggest that's true. And even if we believe it's true, right? Even if we believe it's true, and I think this comes down to the heart of what the closing opposition case is. Even if it is true, these people might be a little more likely to reoffend. The fact that we prevent these people from, the fact that we report these people and put them in prisons in the first place, the fact that people trust the criminal justice system because it fulfills their innermost desires for revenge, which we think is something that adheres in the basis of what a human nature is, means that they're more likely, and a larger volume of these criminals are likely to be put in jail. But lastly, right, just the desire for revenge, the idea that humans ought to have some sort of retributive justice, the idea that there ought to be compensation for victims, as opening opposition points out in their speech, means that we sometimes, even if another victim is more likely to be hurt in the future, means that we can consider the needs of those victims, the needs of catharsis, as being more important than the fact that we allow more crime to take place in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, incredibly proud to you.
Thanks very much. Go make friends outside. We're also going to leave. We're all going to do it.
Do we need stuff?